We're standing on Park Avenue at the intersection of 52nd Street. Park Avenue has long been considered New York's most prestigious boulevard. We're surrounded by some of New York's most precious architectural gems: Lever House, Waldorf Astoria, Hemsley Palace, and behind me is the Seagram Building, designed by Mies van der Rohe and finished in 1958. Right next to me is a beautiful piece of green Italian marble that Audrey Hepburn and George Peppard sat during the filming of Breakfast at Tiffany's. However, Park Avenue wasn't always considered the prestigious address that it is today. A little over 150 years ago, it was quite literally considered the wrong side of the tracks because there was an open train line that ran all the way down through the island to south of 14th Street. Because of the smog and pollution that steam trains created, the city started banning tracks south of 14th Street. When that got too hard to manage, they pushed the line back to 23rd Street and Madison Square Park. Then eventually, no tracks were allowed south of 42nd, which resulted in Grand Central being located where it is today. Within less than 50 years, Grand Central was rebuilt 3 times to manage the increasing density that was flooding into New York. The first iteration was the Grand Central Depot, which was replaced by Grand Central Station no less than 30 years later, which ultimately was replaced by Grand Central Terminal that opened in 1913. And it was based on the principle of what became Terminal City. Terminal City was underpinned by switching from steam trains to electric trains, which in addition to removing the smog and the steam that was dangerous for the city, it allowed several tiers of tracks to come into Grand Central and increase the density of ridership. But in addition to that, it allowed the tracks to be paved over. And the cost of Grand Central was paid for by Vanderbilt selling the air rights of all the real estate above those tracks. That ultimately led to the principle of transfer development rights, which today, the ability to sell and transfer air rights is one of the fundamental principles of New York City zoning. Once the tracks were covered, every company wanted an address on Park Avenue. An important development occurred in 1961 when the New York City zoning text was changed to limit the amount of area that could be built on each particular site relative to the size of the site. This was called floor area ratio that allowed you to build a certain percentage of area based on how big your site was. However, many buildings had already been built on Park Avenue prior to the 1961 text change, and they were larger in size than the new zoning allowed. An adverse effect to this was that any developer was no longer incentivized to pull down his older, much larger building because they wouldn't be allowed to rebuild a building of similar size. Ultimately, as the building stock became more and more outdated, Fortune 500 companies started looking elsewhere. So in response, New York City initiated the idea of Midtown East rezoning. One Vanderbilt ultimately became the perfect poster child for why East Midtown was necessary. One of the major benefits occurs at and below grade with the connections into public infrastructure, tying into the New York City subway station, tying into Metro North, and tying ultimately into the Grand Central pedestrian network that exists below grade. One of my favorite stories about the design of One Vanderbilt has to do with the history of Terminal City and the connection back to what was here 100 years ago. When we were uncovering the foundations of the existing building, there had been an old Irish pub on this very spot where I'm standing right now. And when we went into the basement to explore the foundations, we uncovered this beautiful old marble wall behind an entire wall of empty kegs of Guinness. And once we moved the kegs out of place, we found that the wall was actually an old elevator core. And by researching old drawings, we found that that elevator core connected directly to Grand Central 100 years ago, but had been abandoned and forgotten. That core would take commuters right from the trains up into the building that was above. So one of the more poetic moments for me in the design of One Vanderbilt is that we recreated that connection and connected back to one of the principal tenets of Terminal City that had been put in place with the original development of Grand Central. So here we are in the lower level of One Vanderbilt, and you can quickly see how the redesign of One Vanderbilt reconnects the new building into a lot of the old infrastructure. You can see a connection to Grand Central on the right. On the left is a connection up to 43rd Street. Over here, we have a connection down to East Side Access and up to 42nd Street. Over here, we have a connection to the New York City subway station. And ultimately now we're going to walk into the entrance to the ob deck, get on the dedicated elevators that will take us to the very top of the building, where we'll enjoy a 360-degree view of the entire city of New York. It's always lovely to come up here and experience the design of One Vanderbilt, but also to see much of the other work that KPF has developed around the city. Very quickly, we can see Hudson Yards that exists only about a quarter of a mile away. We can see the completion of 520 Fifth Avenue. We can see ongoing construction at the beginning of 343 Madison and 570 Fifth Avenue. But perhaps one of the things that strikes me personally about how different One Vanderbilt is its comparison to a building that I helped design at the very beginning of my career at KPF, and that was 745 7th Avenue. That was developed on the edge of the Times Square subdistrict 25 years ago. During that time, one would never open up the building to the public, and those buildings were intentionally designed to be more inwardly looking for corporate headquarters. In contrast, Vanderbilt has been developed to invite the public to the top of the building, to participate in the skyline of New York, and to connect to many elements of the public infrastructure in a much more inviting way, in a much more civically responsible way. I've been up here over 1,000 times, and I always take the exact same photograph of the Chrysler Building. It's a gorgeous view, and it'll never get old. Here we are on the site of 343 Madison, another KPF project. It's 2 blocks up from One Vanderbilt and about half the size, but capitalizing on the benefits of East Midtown. It is a fine example of, again, transit-oriented development where there's a connection that ties in directly to the East Side Access concourse, 60 feet below grade, and that in turn ties into the subway system, Metro North, and Grand Central Terminal. One Vanderbilt and 343 Madison are great examples how buildings need to be designed to play a responsible role in urban planning, to engage, participate, and enhance the neighborhoods within which they're part of.